Spared from the ravages of time and from man's innate lust for destruction, this very old, extraordinary book has survived to the present day. Although many of its pages have been lost, those that remain are fascinatingly beautiful in their purple and silver perfection. The book is at least 1,400 years old, and there is no doubt it is one of the oldest illuminated manuscript volumes in existence today. In this film, we will retrace the history of this art masterpiece and the Byzantine world in southern Italy to which we owe its safekeeping. Invading hordes, marauders, mass migrations, raiding nomadic warriors. Miniatures in many of the world's great libraries and museums show how from the 4th century AD on, the Empire of Byzantium was subjected to the onslaught of aggressive nomadic peoples in search of new living space. They came from everywhere. From the east, from the south, from the steppes of Russia and the deserts of Arabia. Slavs, Avars, and Hungars from the east. To the south, in Palestine, Syria, and the lower part of Turkey, the aggressors were Arabs and Persians. By the 7th and 8th centuries, anarchy seemed to be triumphing over law and order. The situation was aggravated by the fact that many of the Byzantine Empire's Christian communities were torn by internal strife. One of the main sources of dissent was the iconoclastic movement that demanded the destruction of all sacred images. Attempts to implement such radical ideas invariably led to social disorder. Free-thinking intellectuals challenged the authority of central government. Solitary wise men were driven to seek refuge in the deserts of the Middle East. An ideal haven throughout the ages for those desiring an austere hermit's existence. Although these desert hermits represented many different faiths, they all sought answers to their mental conflicts by following different sections of the same path. The fanaticism of the iconoclastics was fired with hate. Their enemy was the central power of the empire that used images to represent and glorify itself, and in so doing blasphemed the name of God. In their blind conviction, the iconoclast's idea of the devil could even take the form of an illuminated manuscript, of a book. And so, the illustrated book, a cherished part of the Byzantines' cultural heritage, became for the iconoclasts an object to destroy, to burn to a cinder. Many of the empire's Middle Eastern provinces were abandoned in the face of persecution by invading forces. Villages and even cities became ghost towns. This is all that remains of the Byzantine city of Avdad in Palestine. It was destroyed in the 7th century. Many Christian communities fled from the coasts of the Near East. They crossed the Mediterranean Sea. The Byzantine exodus went on for many years toward the hospitable shores of southern Italy. The refugees repopulated and cultivated areas which the decline of Rome had left deprived and undeveloped, not only in a material sense. The Byzantines were one of the most intelligent peoples of their day, and they found their new home immensely stimulating. Their creativity took on a new, exclusively local style. Their books filled the libraries of monasteries and castles that are only neglected ruins today. Often integrated into the walls and towers of defenses thrown up by later generations to ward off attacks from the sea. Many communities chose Sicily as their new country. But even here, they could not escape the Arabs. On June 16th, 827, Sinan Asad el-Furat and his men landed on the island, which was by that time completely in the hands of the Byzantine Empire. Syracusa was the island's capital. It held out against the Arab siege for 50 years. But on May 21st, 878, in the words of an eyewitness report, that morning, there was not a sound to be heard. Suddenly, at 6 o'clock, the enemy's war machines shattered the silence. It was like a storm breaking over the city. The enemy broke in and massacred the defenders. The city and its fortress are lost forever. Forced to flee from Sicily, groups of Byzantine survivors moved north toward Rome, creating settlements along the way in the mainland regions of Basilicata and Puglia, and above all, in Calabria. This time, they chose isolated valleys well inland. Towering mountains protected the new communities. Between the peaks of the Aspromonte to the south and the Sila tableland to the east and north, high above the stark white dried-up torrent beds, an ancient road winds its way up to San Giovanni Vecchio. Byzantine monks built these walls in the 11th and 12th centuries. These are the ruins of what was once an important place for prayer and study. A religious community that was not only a seat of learning, but also a flourishing agricultural center. The monks worked the mountainside, creating terraces of fertile soil. This is a field of hemlock. Today it grows wild, but the monks used to grow it and many other herbs to make medical remedies. Later illustrations to the basic treatise of the Greek pharmacologist Pedanius Dioscorides show how widespread this practice became in the Middle Ages. Miniatures that record scientific research, and natural forms that measure time. This contorted, spiraling olive tree, for instance, could be a symbol of the ancient past striving to reach the present day. Not far from Stilo, we find the architectural masterpiece of the Byzantines in southern Italy, the little church known as La Cattolica. A delightful example of pure Byzantine art that, in Italy, achieved an identity all its own. Built during the 10th century, it is still intact and has dominated the neighboring peaks and valleys for 1,000 years. Further north, we find many other traces of the Byzantine presence in this part of Italy. Amid the wild vegetation of this deep valley in central Calabria, we come across the ruins of the 11th century church and monastery of St. Mary of the Tridents. Could this be a surviving reference to the Trident of Neptune? The name suggests the church was built on the site of a pagan temple. An interesting feature of the ruins is these Ionic capitals bricked in upside down. An intentional architectural mistake made perhaps to underline the difference between the Christian building and its predecessor. Ancient stone. Fascinating ruins that help to re-evoke the life of one of Calabria's most famous Byzantine sons, Cassiodorus. He lived in the 6th century, and for many years he was a minister of state under Theodoric the Great. At the height of his career, he became a monk and retired to his estate in the south of Italy. Here, he founded a monastery, the Vivarium, of which all that remains is this miniature depicting it. Cassiodorus set his fellow monks to copying Latin and possibly Greek texts, while he organized a collection of precious codices that probably came from Rome, Ravenna, and the East. Other Byzantine monks chose more humble places in which to pray and meditate. The caves, dotted about Matera, were for centuries inhabited and decorated by Basilian monks. Their art reflects disciplined, mystic Byzantine creativity in a fascinating, almost naive form. The chapel cave of the Madonna of the Cross. Its limestone walls show evidence of centuries-old use. In the back, all that remains of once vivid frescoes. In St. Barbara's Cave, a series of arches leads to the chapel. We find more frescoes in the cave of St. Nicholas of the Greeks. Again, time has taken its toll, but one detail of the work of the unknown Byzantine artist records the presence of a written page. Scenes of a day-to-day existence based on the formula of prayer and meditation, inextricably fused with the culture that was the cornerstone of the Byzantine way of life in Italy at all social levels. Lastly, the cave dedicated to Santa Lucia of the Mallows. In spite of the poor materials, the artworks are exquisite, like these frescoes in their limestone niches. A St. George, depicted as a soldier of Byzantium. A vigilant but forgotten custodian of a vast area that still has much to tell us about a people who had a deep effect on this part of Italy. The desolation we find today is misleading. These sites were once links in a political and religious system that changed the course of history. Another little chapel, the Cappella del Pilerio, introduces us to Rossano Calabro, a 6th century Byzantine fortress that held out successfully against repeated Arab attacks. For this reason, too, it was popular with the empire's hierarchy. Governor Nicephorus Phocas and the famous strategist Basilius stayed here in the 10th century. The city's favored status is reflected in the grandeur of many buildings of the time. In particular, the Patirion, a splendid monastery that lies in the forest overlooking the city. The original Byzantine style of this complex of monumental buildings was modified in the year 1000, when the area was conquered by Robert Guiscard, and Rossano came under Norman dominion. In the face of tenacious resistance to their project to re-Latinize the church and install a Catholic bishop, the Normans allowed Rossano a wide degree of autonomy. As a result, in Rossano, the church liturgy and language remained Greek for another 400 years. The Patirion is southern Italy's most famous monastery. Its scriptorium, or library, was responsible for collecting and preserving a large number of codices. After the fall of Byzantium in 1453, this priceless cultural heritage was split up, and examples can now be found in museums all over the world. Those scattered codices and these fortunately preserved mosaics are ample proof of the Byzantine identity of the south of Italy, and especially of this city. An identity revealed by other precious relics, such as the Panagia, with its herringbone pattern brick decoration on the wall of the apse and mullioned windows. Inside, parts of 2 frescoes have survived. The face of St. Basil of Caesarea and a faded picture of St. John Chrysostom. The gem of Rossano's Byzantine architectural heritage is, without doubt, San Marco, built in the 9th century. 5 domes with single aperture windows and 3 apses. The church is the twin of Stilo's La Cattolica and is one of the most harmonious examples of Italian-Greek monastic architecture. It also has exceptional remains of wall paintings. Another Byzantine fresco painting is the so-called Icona Achiropita. The word Achiropita means not painted by the hand of man, and was probably applied to the picture because its origins are unknown. Next door to the cathedral, we find the Museum of Sacred Art. Here is kept the most precious object, saved and preserved by the Byzantines of Italy. The famous Purple Codex, known as the Rossanensis. This priceless book contains illuminated pages depicting the life and teachings of Jesus. Each miniature illustrates key events in the gospel story with quotes from the Old Testament prophets. Codex Purpureus Rossanensis, the Purple Codex of Rossano Calabro, is an outstanding monument to an age when bookmaking was an art form. The more color was used, interwoven with gold and silver script, the more valuable the volume became. In the 6th century, books were almost worth their weight in gold, and only the ruling class and the church could afford to commission them. Only 3 other illuminated examples of the Purple Greek Codex are known to exist today. They can be found in Paris, Vienna, and London, but they are much less complete. Although the Codex of Rossano no longer has the Gospels of Luke and John, its 376 pages make it unique. Miniatures that tell the story of Christ's miracles. The blind man's sight restored. The curing of the leper. Historically, it had great significance as a devotional book. First, in the era in which it was produced, a time when sacred objects and images began to be more important than holy men. And then, it became a prized religious relic when it was brought to Calabria, embodying, over the centuries, the region's tradition of Byzantine culture. And, of course, it has its own intrinsic value as an artwork, expressed by the harmonious balance that exists between the purity of the purple parchment, the gold and silver script, and the liveliness of the illustrations. According to a theory formulated by Professor William Lurker, the illustrations have been copied in miniature into the book from a series of grandiose paintings. The judgment of Pilate. The betrayal of Judas. The 30 pieces of silver. The dramatic act of expiation. The story of Christ is thus reduced to the ancient equivalent of a strip cartoon without losing any of its impact. An extraordinary degree of spiritual energy and riveting suspense, finely balanced with exquisite pathos, leaps from every page. The book's origins and the date of its production are unknown. Some scholars place it in the 5th century, but the style of the writing and illustrations are more compatible with works that date back to the middle of the 6th century. It is almost universally accepted that the book was not produced in Italy, and most likely came from the East. But the exact location can only be guessed at. It might have been made in a book workshop or scriptorium in any one of a dozen cities: Ephesus, Alexandria, Caesarea, and so on. The ancient city of Antioch in Syria is cited as a possibility by many scholars. The Codex was officially discovered in Rossano in 1846, but there is no doubt it had been there for centuries. A book steeped in history, but unable to tell its own story. Paradoxical but true, this precious sacred work has been read, studied, and preserved through the ages by an untold number of people who have never dared blemish it with names, notes, or dates. The mystery of the Codex's origins add to its status as a monumental volume. A monument to the Byzantine period in southern Italy. A cultural heritage that plays a significant role in the ancient fabric of Mediterranean history. So heavily influenced by the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Palestinians, the Sicilians, the Calabrians. A Mediterranean Byzantine civilization that would not conform to the empire represented by Constantinople. A civilization that left a legacy of faith and culture. A priceless heritage that only in southern Italy was preserved miraculously intact for centuries.
You may think of the environmental movement as a more recent occurrence, but more than 150 years ago, the American poet-naturalist Henry David Thoreau left the daily routine of town life and came to these woods in Concord, Massachusetts, just 15 miles from Boston. He built a cabin by this pond and recorded his observations of nature, which would later become his most famous work, Walden. In his book, Thoreau urged society to appreciate nature and to establish a balance between humankind and the environment during the 2 years he lived at Walden Pond, from July 1845 to September 1847. He took daily walks through the woods and developed his ideas on conservation and forest succession. He urged the creation of national parks and river walks along America's waterways, which would provide public access to nature. Despite the fact that more than half of the 2,600 acres of Walden Woods are protected by the state of Massachusetts and the towns of Lincoln and Concord, this birthplace of American environmentalism was itself threatened by two commercial developments in the mid-1980s. Bear Garden Hill was one of Thoreau's favorite places for reflection. Had it not been for the efforts of conservation groups, some of Thoreau's favorite spots would now be office parks and condominium complexes, just a short distance from his cabin. Today, Thoreau's writings have taken on an even greater meaning in a world struggling to balance progress and preservation. And this place, Walden Pond, carries with it a symbolic message of hope to millions of people worldwide who share in Thoreau's appreciation for nature and yearning toward wildness. I'm Tom Trinley with Notes from the Field.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Illinois Humanities Council. Corporate support has been provided by the Many Sides of Sears.